what are the three things, the three legs on the stool that has kept Putin in power all this time? Well, for a long time they were making Russians a bit richer. That's kind of stopped at the moment. Making Russia great again. That's what he's trying to do in Ukraine. That's kind of, I don't know, not racing ahead, and lots of Russians are dying as a result of that. And then keeping Russians safe and avoiding the chaos of the 1990s, which was economic chaos on the one hand, but also chaos from Chechen terrorism and Chechen war. So there is definitely a path from Friday's events that can lead to a weakening of President Putin.
Now, President Putin has declared a national day of mourning in Russia after the death toll from the mass shooting at a Moscow concert hall reached 133. It is Russia's worst terror attack since the Beslan school siege in 2004, in which more than 300 people were killed. 186 of them were children. We're joined now in the studio by Timothy Phillips, who is author of Beslan, The Tragedy of School Number One. Morning to you, and thank you for coming in.
Good morning.
For people who maybe say, Beslan, I remember the name, I can't quite remember what happened, just remind us.
Yeah, school in the south of Russia, right on the border with Georgia, very close to the border. First day of the school year, traditionally a day of kind of carnival and celebration in Russia. And suddenly, as those celebrations are kicking off in school number one in Beslan, armed terrorists rush in and take pretty much all of the teachers, pupils, and of course lots of parents who are there for the first day hostage. Hostage crisis continues for 3 days. The Russian security services surround the school. There's some negotiation. A very small number of mothers with babies are allowed out on the second day. But then on the third day, something happens. Either a bomb goes off in the school or someone fires from outside and basically the school blows up. Hundreds are killed and thousands are injured.
And I remember, I was young in my journalistic career, I remember covering it live, and it was considered at the time that some mistakes were made, weren't there, by the Russian authorities?
Yes, I mean, there were a lot of conspiracy theories, as there always are in Russian politics, Russian current affairs. Certainly it was the case that the response was heavy-handed. There were allegations that tanks were used. Well, you wouldn't normally fire on a school if you want to save the people inside it. There were allegations also that some chances had been missed in the weeks running up to the attack to apprehend the terrorists. And then there were allegations afterwards of a cover-up. Interestingly, looking back from the perspective of today, Russia was already kind of becoming more authoritarian at that point, but there were a number of independent or semi-independent inquiries at the time. And I was thinking how after the events of Friday in Moscow, that's probably very unlikely to happen inside Russia this time.
Because it is worth remembering, President Putin was in power 20 years ago. So I just wonder what lessons were learnt by the Russian authorities after the Beslan school siege?
So Beslan, and 2 years before that, the siege in the school in the theatre in Moscow, were both examples of how Putin changed Russia's approach to terrorist attacks. Really, it's unimportant to save the victims. That is ancillary. If you do that, that's great. What's important is to liquidate the terrorists and to make sure that there's no sense in which they have won. So obviously negotiating with terrorists for a hostage swap could give them something that looks like a victory or a partial victory. That all stopped with Putin. And I think this obviously hasn't been a hostage crisis this time, but we can see that the emphasis is on saying we've apprehended all of the terrorists immediately, and we're going to kind of do whatever's necessary to destroy them and those who put them up to it.
Are we clear on, obviously it's been 20 years since something as horrific as this has happened. Is that because the threat hasn't been there, or is it because the Russian authorities have been able to keep a grip on this? Because one of the arguments, of course, now is that President Putin is distracted by the war in Ukraine and has failed in his duty of protecting Russians at home.
So fortunately, these kind of events are rare but not unknown in capital cities across kind of the world. And so I'm not sure that the frequency of them or the severity of them tells us all that much. I think it is very significant that Putin has immediately felt it necessary to find a Ukrainian link, even if many people think that's implausible, the idea that Ukraine was somehow in a position to open its border, even if it wanted to, given how many Russian security forces and army lie between the part of Russia that the terrorists were found escaping and the border itself. But of course, Putin is fighting a war against what he calls Ukrainian terrorists, and he isn't currently fighting a war against Islamist terrorists. And so the narrative of I'm doing something, things are under control, you can only really maintain that as President Putin at the moment if you're talking about the Ukraine war. You can't about Islamism.
And is this a similar threat? So the people who carried out the Beslan school siege, is it a similar group, similar ideology who carried out the Moscow attack?
It's similar in some ways. It is Islamist, and that was what was believed to be the case in 2004. In 2004, the set of issues that were probably motivating the terrorists were more homegrown. So you will recall, your listeners will recall the Chechen conflict, and it was somehow fallout from that. It's not so clear this time if it turns out to be the case that the terrorists were mainly from Tajikistan, which is a former part of the Soviet Union with a border with Afghanistan. It's not entirely clear what's motivating them or the people who have trained them. Russia went to war in Syria to back President Assad, and that was partly to defeat Islamic State. So Islamic State as an organization has a reason to dislike him for that. Putin also, we hear, has a package that his security forces offer to anti-Islamist dictators in Africa to prop them up. And so there are a number of places in Africa at the moment where Russian forces are operating to shore up kind of shaky dictatorships there. That may also be a reason why Islamic State wanted to strike against Russia at the moment.
Gosh, it's fascinating. What was the impact on Putin's power after Beslan? Because there's some questions now. We can speak to Mark Galeotti in about 20 minutes, who's a Russia expert, who's talking about how this will impact Putin today. How did it impact him after the Beslan siege?
Well, I mean, he's still in power, so in the ultimate sense, it didn't do him all that much damage. But the things that were said at the time were, first of all, that the live unfolding of this event over 3 days on the news was incredibly damaging. And there were huge restrictions placed on live news broadcasts from events like that in Russia immediately after Beslan that have never been lifted because of the kind of weakness it shows of a place falling apart, a place under attack. Secondly, and this we still don't know the answer to after Friday's tragic events, Putin seemed very reluctant to go to Beslan and do what you would think any national leader would do in the wake of such a tragedy, which is to go to a hospital, be pictured comforting victims. He went at night. He went for a very short time, and it was thought that he wanted to avoid being criticised by local people. But also, it's thought more generally that Putin hates being pictured alongside suffering Russians who have suffered because of something that might be a failure of the state. He really likes the kind of photo opportunities which are more victorious. And that's the kind of thing where if he doesn't do it, even though, of course, the media in Russia won't say anything about it, people in Russia will lodge what he does with regard to the victims of this attack and remember it potentially against him.
There's some suggestion now there could be some kind of crackdown, more authoritarian crackdown by Putin. Was there anything like that after Beslan, or would you expect that now?
I mean, one of the interesting things that happened after Beslan was there used to be elections for local governors in Russia. So just as you would have anywhere for local government. Immediately after Beslan, Putin just started appointing them all because he felt he had insufficient control over the local people on the ground, some of whom spoke out against the kind of national federal FSB message about what had gone wrong in Beslan and what had gone right. There could be a crackdown. There could be a crackdown against Muslims in Russia. A lot of them already suffer Islamophobic abuse, but there is actually a large Muslim community, and at times Putin has tried to ally himself with liberal elements of that. We could also see, if he decides to really pursue the connection to Ukraine, that this becomes one of the things that allows him to mobilize hundreds of thousands of young Russian men again, which is something
he needs to do,
exactly,
doesn't he?
Which is something people believe he was building up to do anyway.
Do you think that this will have any? I mean, clearly, he's just had an election where he made sure that he won. It was not free and fair by any means. But will this weaken him? We've talked, haven't we, when we think about the context of Alexei Navalny's death recently and the lack of opposition within Russia. Is something like this, because protection of the population is what people are going to care about. If they don't feel safe in their own country, that's going to be a worry for Putin. Does that travel? Does that does that translate into anything, or do you think he'll be able to get control of that narrative and turn it into a strength?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. What are the three things, the three legs on the stool that has kept Putin in power all this time? Well, for a long time, they were making Russians a bit richer. That's kind of stopped at the moment. Making Russia great again. That's what he's trying to do in Ukraine. That's kind of, I don't know, not racing ahead, and lots of Russians are dying as a result of that. And then keeping Russians safe and avoiding the chaos of the 1990s, which was economic chaos on the one hand, but also chaos from Chechen terrorism and Chechen war. So there is definitely a path from Friday's events that can lead to a weakening of President Putin, but really it won't happen in a straightforward way, because there are not organs like TimesRadio or the BBC or newspapers putting out any of this criticism within Russia. It's happening on Telegram chats, it's happening on WhatsApp chats, those kind of things, and it could be the case. It's very significant. I think this has happened in Moscow. Opinion in Moscow. Moscow has been insulated from the Ukraine war to a great extent. The people serving for Russia in Ukraine are not from Moscow. They are from Siberia. They are from far, far away, from poor peasant communities. So this will be a shock in Moscow, which feels itself to be kind of a world city that's immune from things like this.
Absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for coming in. Really grateful to you. That is Timothy Phillips. He's the author of Beslan, The Tragedy of School Number One.